I'm very thrilled to turn things over to our moderator, Soledad O'Brien. She is an award-winning journalist and news anchor on CNN, MSNBC, The Today Show, and so much more. She was inducted into the Broadcasting and Cable Hall of Fame in May 2023. She hosts many podcasts. She wrote a critically acclaimed memoir, The Next Big Story, and she's also the CEO of Soledad O'Brien Productions. And so she will be joined on stage by Liz Willen, the editor-in-chief of the Hechinger Report, as well as Atnre, Alleyne, co-founder and CEO of TeenSHARP, and Rick Sander, the distinguished professor of law at UCLA School of Law. So we're really excited for this conversation, and it is my pleasure to turn things over to Soledad and our panel.
Hey everybody, I'm Soledad O'Brien, and I am thrilled to have the opportunity to moderate this panel, which is really a look at what education looks like post-affirmative action. Soledad O'Brien Productions has partnered with the Hechinger Report for a documentary that we did. I'm going to be showing a couple of clips of that doc. For now, many years, actually, we've been doing projects together, and we know that combining a staff that is expert in education data and reporting on inequity, along with visual journalism, we can kind of dig deeper into questions of why are the institutions that enable learning and advancement often failing to actually do so. So this partnership has allowed us to leverage having multiple reporters, and that means that we can cover lots of different territory and present our work in different formats. Major press, I'm embarrassed to say, seems to have sort of abandoned one of the bread and butter issues that journalism is actually charged with covering: how we educate America's children. And without nonprofit journalists, I think it's fair to say, like the ones at the Hechinger Report, we would fail to give the public critical information and analysis on a fundamental service that governments deliver to their children. So with that, we'll get started. In our documentary, we wanted to examine the aftermath of affirmative action. What happened? Why? What is the landscape going to look like as we move forward? So I'd like to begin with a very short clip from our documentary. Will you play that, please? This is every TV anchor's nightmare. You tossed your video. I know it like the back of my hand. I could act it out for everybody if you want. Do you guys have that clip? They're working on it. Okay, we'll give you a second. Well, Liz, while we're waiting for that clip, why don't you start us off and give us a description? We started in that story of telling the story of students. The documentary really follows students. Why don't you inform everybody?
And that is such an important point here. Also, I want to thank everybody who's stuck around, because I think this is the last panel of the day before the before tonight's band shell extravaganza. And it's a long and exhausting conference with a lot going on, and we are not going to be talking about AI at all. So I'm so pleased that you're still here. And while we're waiting for the clip, I wanted to say it's been such a pleasure working on this documentary with these guys, because we got to know families and students and really tell the story. I mean, there's a lot of history about the Supreme Court decision, of course. We'll touch on that a little bit, and you'll hear that in the documentary. But what really matters is how it impacts students. And in particular, we followed a family called the Rodriguez family, and I think if we get the clip up, you'll see a little bit more about them and what they went through in their journey. But I do want you to know what we really are trying to find out here, and we don't know so many answers to, is what is going to happen next. It was last year in June that the Supreme Court knocked out race-conscious admissions as a factor. That had a huge impact on the students that one of the stars of the film, who you'll also meet here, Atnre, Alleyne, the students that he works with, some incredible students, and he's doing great work with them. You'll really get a chance to see what happens to them. And in a lot of this, we still don't know the answer to,
And you might be screening the doc on your flight home on the plane. Do you guys have that clip or no? Because we'll move forward without it. Okay, you're gonna have to screen it by yourselves. It is streaming on CBS. Well, let me give a better and longer introduction for all of my panelists. The clip really sets up one of the young students that we follow. We basically just do a follow doc on what does it look like now that affirmative action has ended. Liz Willen, who you met a moment ago, is the editor-in-chief of the Hechinger report, longtime journalist in education. She's led the Hechinger staff since 2011, I think.
Something like that.
Richard Sanders, right next to me, is a professor of law at UCLA. He's also an economist. He's taught at UCLA since 1989, where he serves as director of the UCLA Rand Center for Law and Public Policy. He evaluates social inequity and also social policies. That's nice to have you. And Atnre, Alleyne is a co-founder of TeenSHARP, an organization that prepares students of color for top colleges and equity-centered leadership. So then, Liz, since we don't have our clips, let's just kick off our conversation. And I want you to first give us a little history about affirmative action. What was the state of college admissions before this decision was made?
Well, before this decision, we're going to go back a little bit to something that happened here at ASU+GSV. Did anyone see Ruby Bridges speak? To me, that was the most incredible way to start thinking about what we want to talk about here in this panel, because she was 6 years old when she integrated schools in Louisiana and New Orleans, and really gave a powerful story of what it was like to be the only Black student. This was in the, I think it was 1960, the early 60s, around the time when the civil rights movement was kicking off, and it's around that time that affirmative action kind of came into being as a way for, to really make up for years and years of historical inequities in populations. And her story reminded me of how far so many students have come, like Ruby, but also it reminded me of, you know, over the years, when we've been following this issue at the Hechinger report, we have found repeatedly that while affirmative action definitely made things better, and Atnre can talk a little bit about better for his students, Black and Hispanic students, and gave them opportunities that they might not otherwise have had because they got like a little nudge or a tip in admissions. Without that, you're going to see what we're really trying to figure out is what happens next after the Supreme Court ruled that race can no longer be a factor in admissions. So that is a really a big question that we have and that we're going to be talking about. I think the court's decision, it felt, for many it thought it was settled law. There'd been lots and lots of challenges. Last year we had on stage here with us at ASU+GSV, Michael Wang, who was a student who was part of the Students for Fair Admission suit, and he was one of the Asian students who was rejected getting into Harvard, and he wanted to know why. He kept asking why. I had perfect track record, I had great test scores, like so many people who get rejected from schools like that, but he became part of the lawsuit. Interestingly enough, when he spoke last year, he said he wasn't really aware of that, what he said, I'm not sure if what I did was the right thing. He wondered if he had pushed the pendulum too far back. And I think we're going to see now with the students that Atnre works with how that is actually going for them now that the court has made its ruling. You know, they're getting their acceptances now, and you'll have a better chance of telling us about how they're doing.
Liz, let me ask you just one more question before we move on to Richard, which is, what has worked when it comes to diversifying the student body? I think there's a sense that from some, I know this in newsrooms, that affirmative action opened up the doors, Black students and Latino students were flooding in, and the numbers were amazing, and it's been wildly successful, and the truth is that is just inaccurate.
Hardly. Our reporting at the Hechinger report found, particularly at the flagship schools, for example, students of color were way, way behind. I don't want to say, we're talking about Blacks and Hispanics. I'm going to be very specific here. We also have found at the elite schools, and that's what we're talking about in this documentary and these issues, the numbers were terrible. They were better than they might have been, but you know, some of the schools had 3% Black, 7% Black, 4%. 7% was high in some of the data analysis we did. So while they fared better than they might now going forward, the track record in a lot of ways was pretty abysmal at top schools.
So Professor Sander, if I can talk to you, I'd love for you to give us some information about the role of wealth in entry into these schools, the elite schools specifically.
Sure, but can I just make a couple of prefatory comments?
You absolutely can.
Thanks.
Because you have a mic, and it's hot.
So this is a complex topic, and we have very little time to talk about it. So forgive me for engaging in generalizations. And I also don't want to downplay the many examples of really strong and passionate programs that make a difference in reaching out to minority youth.
I feel like there's a but coming.
But it's important that we look at these things systemically and try to understand how is this kind of operating as an overall process. First thing to know is that we're not ending affirmative action. In some ways, we're beginning affirmative action now, because affirmative action is about the whole collection of processes by which we expand the pool of people who are applying to college, and we use more creative ways of evaluating those people. I observed at the University of California, which passed a ban on racial preferences back in 1996, that event sparked a whole generation of creativity that greatly expanded the pool of people in California who are going to college. The numbers, we not only dramatically improved the socioeconomic diversity, but by, I'd say, 9 out of 10 metrics, we improved the racial diversity over time, too, because we were doing a better job of expanding the pool and preparing people for college.
But if I asked you to say that number at elite colleges, is that the case?
Well, UC as a whole is a pretty elite college. Now, at Berkeley and UCLA, black first-year freshman admittees are still down from before 1996, but at the seven of the other campuses, it's up. The black graduates are up because more of the students who are coming have smaller credential gaps with existing students. So their success rate has gone up dramatically.
Even though the actual number is lower at Berkeley.
The number coming in is lower, the number going out is higher, partly because there's an aggressive transfer program. So lots of students enter Berkeley and UCLA as juniors. They transfer in from community colleges. That's part of the new outreach track that is another form of affirmative action. A key thing that disillusioned me with racial preferences was my studies of legal education, where I found that over 40 years we were having first-year classes that on average were 8% black, but only 5% of the lawyers were black. And the reason was that we were using such large preferences that they were having a very disparate academic effect. Students receiving large preferences, regardless of their race, were ending up near the bottom of the class and were having really poor success on bar exams, and were often just leaving the law because they felt disillusioned about how the process had treated them. Eliminating large preferences has a positive effect on academic performance.
May I ask you a question there?
Yeah.
You're attributing that to those students being, I believe, being unqualified, and I would imagine others could argue, well, maybe there is a process in law school that is challenging to black students that has to do more about race and racism and not necessarily a lack of qualification.
Right, and that was probably a question that I started the whole enterprise with. But when you control for race, you find what matters is the credentials gap. And it's not a question of being unqualified, it's a question of what school you're going to. How well matched are you with the students around you? There's students, I just published an article showing that the bar passage rate for students who went to UCLA with weak credentials, regardless of race, was about 30% if they had an LSAT and undergraduate GPA of, say, 153. If they went to a school where that was the median of the class, the bar passage rate was 78%. So it was a dramatic difference. But to get to your question about wealth, second thing that disillusioned me about racial preferences is that when you use race as the criterion and you're not focusing on socioeconomic status, the overwhelming share of beneficiaries are people from relatively affluent backgrounds, often wealthy people. 80% of the blacks who are admitted to top law schools through racial preferences come from the top, I think, the top fifth of the socioeconomic distribution. So you are, creating a subset of privilege within the established order. You're not really broadening paths of opportunity.
And a follow-up to that would be, are you arguing that middle-class or upper-class black students don't experience racism?
They experience dramatically less racism than they did 60 years ago. They attend elite colleges. They attend college at far higher rates than whites with comparable credentials do. They attend elite colleges at double the rate of whites with comparable credentials.
We know that wealthy students will, I think the number is either double or triple the number of wealthy students will go off to elite colleges specifically than their counterparts who are middle class and might actually have better academics. So it seems to me if there's an affirmative action, it might really be toward wealthy students. That money is playing a giant role in this.
Right, but my point is that racial preferences tended to rigidify that system instead of breaking it down. In this new era, my hope is that schools will do what the University of California did, which is try to broaden paths socioeconomically. Focus on individual characteristics that disadvantage individuals. Don't go by skin color. Go by what are the circumstances of that person in front of me. And I think the Supreme Court decision pretty much explicitly said that should be the path.
Atnre, I'd love to bring you in on this conversation.
Please.
Just trying to get, we got to lay the groundwork first, is how these work.
I get it. I just find I find it very curious is maybe a nice word. Painful is a more realistic word. That after hundreds of years of race-based policies that marginalized, right, that plundered, right, that blocked progress for families, right, then we talk about being race neutral at this point, right? I think it's important to say, because I think in this conversation it's hard to really come to any consensus when we don't talk about historical facts, right? When we don't talk about the hundreds of years and the persistent and present day racial inequalities and racial injustice. When we talk with a historical amnesia, right? It's easy then to kind of disconnect and say, well, why do we need this? Someone came when we did the screening earlier today from a person from India and said, I don't really understand the race versus class, right? So let me break it down for you, right? But we're at an education conference, right? And there's a study that came out from EdBuild years ago that talked about schools that are predominantly black, which because of segregation, because of racism, we have this segregation of race in school. They have, those schools have $23 billion less in funding when they're serving the same number of students, okay? We know the research as well that in these schools that are predominantly white teachers, they're less likely to recommend the students that I serve for gifted and talented classes. We know that my children are in preschool. We know that in preschool already, black boys are more likely to put in suspension and so forth in the preschool level. I can go on and on about statistics, right, that speak to the racial inequality, right, that you have to deal with just to make it out to the level of in the higher ed process. So they come to me then in high school, TeenSHARP, 15 years, Black, Latino, and low-income students, preparing them for selective colleges. And what I think is important to mention, I'm going to quote two things. Dr. Randall Pinkett, Rutgers alumnus, as my alma mater, he talks about in his book, Black Faces in White Places, he talks about the ever-changing game, right? When I think about what's changing now, right? The ever-changing game is what my students and my families have had to deal with, and we have to deal with at TeenSHARP. Quote another wonderful thinker, Ta-Nehisi Coates. He said, for some blacks, they're always twice as good, but they're going to find that white predation is thrice as fast. And so when we're looking at what's going on right now, it is not about that my students, if you got to watch the documentary, hopefully you watch it, you'll see how hard they worked, how much they came to our programs on the weekends to work on their math, right, to make sure they know how to work the system, right? And after all of that, we've had 500 plus alums who've gone to selective colleges. I can count on my hands how many of them had a really high SAT score, right? But yet they go to these colleges and they finish. They go to these colleges and they win leadership awards. They go to these colleges. 3 of my alums last year won the Obama and Brian Chesky Fellowship. They pick 100 students across the country, and 3 came from my program. So they're talented, they're amazing, and they're hardworking. The issue is that we have systemic racism, and right now we're trying to be race neutral after hundreds of years of leaning into racism. So that is the thing that I want to continue to engage about.
Yeah, and I think, Rick, you mentioned, in our documentary, we interviewed somebody named David Hinojosa, who was very much in the Students for Fair, representing students in University of North Carolina, and he talked about being a law student, a Mexican law student in Texas, and before Texas eliminated affirmative action, there were, maybe 26 law students in his class, and then who were Black or Hispanic. And by the time he left, after it had changed, there were 3. So I'm not sure where your numbers are coming from, because we also, the data we looked at, it both in Texas and in California, Florida, places that no longer allow race-based admissions, the numbers dropped dramatically. We saw far fewer Black and Hispanic students at these schools. So you kind of made it sound like didn't make much of a difference.
Yeah, so the difference is that he's talking about graduate school, he's talking about law school. And law schools compete on a national platform, right? The University of Texas is not competing for students with other law schools in Texas, certainly not other public law schools in Texas. It's competing with Yale and Berkeley and University of Washington and so on. So if you're in a national market and you're the only school that's not using racial preferences, then yes, the schools that you will admit race neutrally will also have offers from Harvard and Yale and Stanford. So you're going to have a dramatic drop.
But it's also on the undergraduate level.
No, on the undergraduate level, the minority numbers actually went up substantially. And one of the prompts for an earlier suit by Edward Bloom was that he said, look, the overall minority enrollment at University of Texas is higher than it was before the decision that limited racial preferences in Texas, so the affirmative action is not needed. University of California, there's no question that it's been a really dramatic effect. And what's so dramatic is not only was the base broadened and the pool of students admitted stronger, but the outcomes were dramatically better. The 4-year graduation rate for students admitted to Berkeley with large racial preferences in the early 90s was about 15%. 1.5, okay? It's now about 55%, okay? That's the kind of change that we want to see.
I think you could argue that that's not necessarily correlated to the change that you're talking about, right? Schools today have many more supports for students and minority students than they ever had when I was an undergraduate. There was no office that was there to support students' academic achievement. The things that my kids have access to, 2 of them will be going off to college in the fall, 2 have graduated, we just didn't have that. So it seems to me that the times have changed as well in how people are approaching helping minorities get to and through, and also helping students who come from non-traditional backgrounds, students who are from rural backgrounds, et cetera, et cetera. There's a real tangible effort to help them get through.
Yeah. Two quick points. One is that the things that you're talking about which create inequality, many of them are real. I would disagree with you on some of the facts you cite, but undoubtedly there are inequalities in the K-12 pipeline. But our attention needs to be on that. When we try to fix the problem by saying, okay, well, let's just ignore credential differences when we do college admissions, I think ends up being counterproductive. But secondly, we just need to have more intellectual honesty. I mean, even in this room, you can sort of feel there's a very strong vibe against the sort of facts that I'm presenting being articulated. There's a lot of suspicion and a lot of anger. And that's because we have a very one-sided conversation. We are not, when I and others raise the issues with law school performance to our colleagues, the effort was not to engage and try to get to the bottom of what was going on. The effort was to eliminate any data that could be used to further research. And this has been, this is something I experienced for over a decade. Everyone who knows about my work knows that I made many, many good faith efforts to get transparency from institutions. And, they didn't provide it. When you experience dishonesty like that on that scale, you tend to think that, well, maybe we should just shut it down.
I might argue that the one-sided conversation, certainly from a newsroom perspective, seems to be that Black students are stealing the positions of white students. Right. I mean, I think if we went out in the street,
students.
Right, and Asian students, and if we were to go out in the street and just grab people and ask them about affirmative action, that's sort of what they would tell you. And I'm always curious why that same sense of anger does not exist for legacies, and that same sense of annoyance does not exist for athletes who having gone to Harvard, I can personally vouch that some of them were underqualified if you're looking at only SAT scores, but I married one. He's a good guy. Got through, very successful. I forgave him. But, right, the reality was, and also, know some whose great-great-great-grandpa built a building, a large building, and it's named after them, right? So we know the reality of legacies, and that doesn't seem to anger people when you're talking about affirmative action, right? Affirmative action in people's minds is black students, maybe Hispanic students, stealing a spot from somebody else.
And can I jump in, because I know we're saying it's one-sided, but we're sitting here having this conversation because affirmative action, race-based affirmative action is gone.
It's dead.
So it's not, I don't know how, that's really interesting for it to be so one-sided, but yet we have a case right now where it's gone. And we have a case right now that this is not just about that, right? We're seeing that there's moves now to, this is one piece of a larger project, right?
The lawsuits are coming.
Lawsuits are coming, right? The Fearless Fund, right? We know we're here. There's a lot of people looking for investment, venture cap. We know that black women entrepreneurs are getting 1%, so 2% of the funding from venture cap, and they're targeting the Fearless Fund, which invests in black women entrepreneurs, right? So we're knowing that it's not a matter of that it's a one-sided conversation, right? We cannot be ahistoric about this, right? We cannot act as if there's not 400 years of plus history. And we also can't act apolitical about this conversation as if this is just a kind of numbers and data and law conversation, right? There's a political project, right, that is part and parcel of what's been going on in America for so long, right? And so from my standpoint, you asked earlier about students. Our students this admissions class, pre and post affirmative action, are looking great. Right? They're looking great. Ivy Day came a month ago or so. They got into Ivy Leagues. They got into other selective colleges. But it is, as I mentioned before, we have to continue to pivot and work so hard and do things that other people would not do. Right? The students that you will get to see in the documentary have been meeting with us on Saturdays for 4 years, full day. Right? And sometimes we have some of our funders, white funders, and they're like, oh, my kids would never do that, right? These are the things that we have to do to get into a very narrow window, right, that has been caused because of historic injustice, right? And then the window has gotten even narrower, right? And we're going to continue to adapt as my people have done for so long. But I just want to make it clear that this is not just a numbers thing, right, or data thing. This is a broader political project that we need to address.
That's true, and I will agree with you on one thing, Rick, transparency from schools. The Hechinger report reached out to hundreds of colleges and universities, as we will continue to do, because we're working on part 2 right now, and we want to know where Atnre students are going to go. And by the way, a lot of them can't make decisions because the FAFSA fiasco has made it impossible for them to see what kind of aid they're going to get.
That's a whole other panel.
A whole other
FAFSA.
panel, but it will be in part 2. But the thing is, colleges we don't know what's going on because they don't want to tell us. What is your racial and ethnic breakdown? They're going to have to report the numbers at some point. Now they're delayed in those numbers, but I think we all want to know what has changed.
Right. We want schools to be honest about how exactly they're weighting different factors in admissions. Be transparent about that. And how do students perform? What happens? What are the outcomes? If we had that information, we could have such a more robust and meaningful dialogue. But to say a couple things about the future, I mean, I think the experience of your students this year suggests that racial preferences are not gone. In other words, schools are they're still extremely concerned about racial diversity. They're going to be looking at applications very closely to try to identify students like yours who are trying to identify hardships that they've overcome, right? And it's very unclear exactly how large the impact of the Supreme Court decision is going to be. We really are in the dark right now. But I hope we all push for transparency, and I hope we push for greater attention to individual characteristics rather than group characteristics.
We only have a couple minutes left in this panel, and they're telling me the video's ready to play, but I am not going to play it because that would be insane. It would take too long. But I do want to end with a look at, so when do we start knowing? I mean, I think there's just a lot of unknowns at this moment, partly because of lack of transparency, partly because just enough time has not passed. When will we know what has actually come from affirmative action being ended?
You told me you think it's going to take a few years.
Yes. Yeah, I definitely think it will take a few years. There's a lot of, I said it's political, there's a lot of attention on this, right? And people are feeling that And that's one of the things that's there. And we have to look at different things, right? We're kind of conflating so many things here, right? But we have to look at the kind of the income dynamics. We have to look at a lot of factors there in the process. And for my organization, you know, some of the cases, for example, we've had some students with a 3.3 GPA, for example, and you know, just amazing students. You know, find their way into selective colleges with full scholarships, right? For some of those students, it's going to be harder, and that student precisely is one of the ones that I mentioned that got an award first semester and is doing amazingly on those campuses, right? So for some of that, I think we're going to need to look at the different kind of tiers of students. How do they perform before, and then how do they perform after? So.
Yeah, and I just think one thing I wanted to add that we didn't get to talk about. Diversity trickles down into the workplace, and that's really important to this crowd here. And if the schools are becoming whiter and wealthier and more elite, so will our workplace. I mean, your students, you don't know about yours, we also have to remember, are very self-selected. They're working so hard with you, and that's not nationally what you're going to see because of the lack of school counselors to really give them the kind of a hands-on attention that you've been giving these students. So we really don't know.
When do you think we'll know, Richard? I'm going to give you the final word today.
You know, we can't know until we can see breakdowns of not just student ethnicity, but admissions rate by credentials. So it depends on whether schools will respond to FOIA requests and other types of efforts to, you know, get them to fess up.
In our reporting, we're not seeing that kind of...
No, but also they're very threatened by Edward Bloom's lawsuits,
yes,
which he continues to do all the time. So.
Just one other thing, you know,
we are at 0, 0, 0.
Yeah.
So make it a very tight other thing.
It's really tight, but the court's decision has placed a lot of pressure on schools to tone down legacy preferences, which I am enthusiastically pushing.
I'd be curious to follow that as well, because that correlates to big donor dollars sometimes at certain schools. So I'm not sure how much they're going to tamp down on that. I want to thank my panelists. Thank you guys. Appreciate it. And thank the audience. Thank you for sticking with us, even though our clips were non-existent. I hope you'll get a chance to screen the documentary. It's streaming right now on CBS. Appreciate it, everybody.